Hello viewers of Cold Breath. Today I will tell you a story I encountered. If you find this story interesting, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so that I have the motivation to tell you more interesting stories. Nothing that drowns in our river ever truly stays dead. Dad was drunk again. Rain swept over my windshield like waves over a beach as I drove him home from yet another bar where he'd made a fool of himself. He wasn't the drunken brawler type, no. He was a crier. He'd sit at the bar with his head on the table and just start sobbing, wailing, bringing down the whole mood of the place. Even now, he shifted between crying and sniffling while staring out the passenger window, in half-conscious states where he couldn't muster the mental coherence to even register such complex emotions. At one point, he even leaned over the center console and tried to hug me, almost making me jerk the steering wheel. "Dad, no. Christ, I'm trying to drive here," I snapped at him. "Keep on your half of the car, or I'm pulling over." Like a loyal dog, he recognized the tone of my words, even if not their meaning, and shrunk back sheepishly. Since I was in elementary school, people told me I was remarkably mature for my age. But you kind of have to be when you're forced to act like the parent of the family. The road traveled parallel to our sole local river, the one the school kids all called the Devil's Gutter. It snaked in and out of sight behind the tree line, as if it liked to taunt every driver that passed. The damned thing was evil, I knew, but I couldn't help but feel a certain nostalgic fondness for it. It was the only thing offering any sense of danger and mystique to what would have otherwise been the least interesting small town in the country. From a glance, it seemed mild, shallow, and narrow enough to make it across with a leap. There was no way of telling that it was actually hundreds of feet deep, that the undercurrent was stronger than an Olympic swimmer could withstand, that the banks were undercut and impossible to climb back up once you were in, that the carbonated water had intricately carved networks of hundreds of channels and caves deep into the limestone. Misjudge your leap, and you'd be seized by the undercurrent, dashed against the rocks, plunged deep into some dark cave within which your body would be preserved forever, pinned to a wall or ceiling of stone like some macabre decoration. The gutter features in our every folktale and ghost story. When I was a kid, we liked to tell the tale of old Bart O'Neill, a 19th century prospector whose cat was apparently very popular with the neighborhood toms. Every time she'd get knocked up, it was said, he'd gather up the kittens into a burlap sack and toss them all into the Devil's Gutter. At least, and this was when whoever was telling the story would lower their voice to a whisper, until they found his body in his bed, shredded by hundreds of small claws. His eyes had been clawed out, his fingers bitten off like carrots, his ribcage torn open, and within his chest, the police found dozens of tiny poops. That's right. According to legend, the spectral kittens had used his chest cavity as a litter box. That was all made up, of course, the crude invention of imaginative schoolboys. But I have looked through old newspapers and found that someone named Bart O'Neill really did disappear from town a long while ago. No gory details, just up and vanished. The only oddity I noticed was that when his cat was found still locked up in a cage in his shed a week after his disappearance, it was well fed, as if somebody had been sneaking in and caring for it. See, this is why I hate taking this road. With every glimpse of that river, my mind always wanders. Back to old memories, terrible memories, ones that would have been better left forgotten. It ignites a fire in me, a sort of morbid curiosity I've come to dread. But then Dad broke my line of thought with a long, obnoxiously loud groan. And then I was thinking of the first time I had him in my passenger seat, when I was some anxiety-ridden kid, no older than 15, didn't even have my driver's license yet. My hands shaking late that New Year's night as I struggled to dodge all the other drunk morons swerving all over the road. New Year's was always the worst night for him. This would have been our anniversary, he was groaning. It would have been our 15th. I got over what happened to Mom over a decade ago. Why couldn't he? We aren't the only people who've experienced loss anyway. When I was growing up, the whole town mourned the death of Annabelle, captain of our high school cheerleading squad. She had tried to jump the gutter and even cleared it, But there'd just been rain, and the muddy opposite bank gave way beneath her feet, and she went right in. Crazy thing was, 15 minutes later, they got a ping from some SOS beacon her mother had made her wear. They took this as proof she'd made it out alive but injured, and triggered a frantic search of the surrounding area, with no luck. There were rumors, however improbable, that she'd found her way into an air pocket somewhere in that limestone cave system, just close enough to the surface that just one of her desperate calls for help managed to make it through. Sometimes I picture her down there, in a kind of darkness I cannot fathom, struggling to keep her head above the water. I wonder if she knew that surrounding her, somewhere in the dark, were the corpses of those who had been pulled into those caves before her. I picture a gaunt, bleached hand brushing her ankle as those currents carry one by. I imagine her crowded on all sides by the gaunt, empty eyes of the people who'd found their way into that air pocket before her and never found their way out. Maybe it was for the best that she would have been in complete darkness. There my mind went, again. I'd gotten another glimpse of the river and couldn't help but imagine Anna down there, as if her eyes were looking up at me from beneath those blackened waters. I tried to turn up the radio, to take my mind off it, and to drown out Dad's moaning and sobbing, but he grunted as if the very sound offended him and drunkenly pawed at the dashboard until he'd turned it back off. I already knew what he'll say tomorrow. "I've let you down," he'd say, head down like a dog caught peeing on the carpet. "I've never been the father I should have been. And it'll all be very genuine and very sincere and very, very temporary. I've even helped pay for his rehab once. He'd been found choked half to death on his own vomit. This is a wake-up call," he'd said. "I'm finally ready to be the dad you've always needed me to be." A few grand seemed like a small price to pay to have my dad back. And indeed, for a few months of sobriety, he was the best dad on earth, the best I ever could have asked for. And then came New Year's again, and it was suddenly like none of it ever happened. My eyes glimpsed a cross set up along the gutter, a bouquet left at its base. I knew exactly who it was for. When I was in 4th grade, Bethany, a little girl who went to the same school as me, was swallowed up by the gutter. Her father was the only one who witnessed the accident, and there'd been some suspicious circumstances. I don't really remember, something about marital issues, custody, that sort of thing. Point was, everybody suspected him. But what proof did we have? The gutter never parts with its secrets. 3 years or so later, her dad just up and vanished too. Nobody thought much of it at first. Everyone assumed he got tired of the side eyes and just skipped town. But then, months after everyone had forgotten the whole business, someone started sending around a voicemail he'd apparently sent out at 3 in the morning, the night he disappeared. It apparently been sent to some random coworker from his contacts list. An accident, clearly. The first minute or two just consisted of the sort of rustling you'd expect from a pocket dial, so they hadn't thought much of it. It hadn't been until their curiosity drove them to investigate deeper that they realized they could hear the dad's heavy, belabored breathing and the sounds of twigs and leaves crackling beneath his feet, as if he were wandering through the middle of the woods. Moreover, off in the distance, they could hear another voice. The faint voice of a little girl, bubbly and giggling like they were playing a game. "Daddy?" The voice kept crying out into the night. "Daddy, where are you?" They noticed too that you couldn't hear any crickets or birds or anything else you'd expect out in the forest at night. Everything was dead silent, like all the creatures of the woods sensed the presence of a predator. The dad's breathing grew heavier and more panicked whenever the voice grew louder, nearer, but it remained stifled, as if he was desperately trying to keep quiet, remain unnoticed. Eventually, she was so close that you could hear her little footsteps in the leaves, and the dad didn't even dare to breathe. And then, the sound of branches being parted, the father's gasp, and that little voice laughing and declaring in a sing-song tone, "Daddy, I found you!" And at that exact moment, the voicemail reached its time limit. The cop's official line was that it was a fake, just some audio doctored up by bored teenagers to feed into the sensationalized mythology of the Devil's Gutter. But Bethany's remaining relatives swore up and down that they recognized that giggly little voice, that it was unmistakable. Lost in thought, I blinked, and somehow, in that instant, a woman appeared in the middle of the road. I can't remember the next few seconds. It was as if I'd time traveled. One moment, I was driving along, and the next I was stuck in a muddy ditch on the roadside, the hood just inches away from an oak tree sturdy enough to have bisected my car. And Dad was screaming like a madman, incoherently at first, but then congealing into a name. Jessica! He was screaming out for Mom, I realized. Jessica! And as he screamed, he threw open the passenger side door and tore off into the woods with a drunken stumble. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the woman was still standing there in the road, a vague silhouette barely illuminated by whatever moonlight broke through the storm. But when I looked back with my own eyes, she was gone. I cursed like a sailor as I took off into the storm, blindly in the direction I thought my dad had went. My heart was in my throat. We were so close to the gutter. In his state, he could so easily fall in, become just another name in its long list, another creepy story to tell on school playgrounds. But then it became clear I was in the same danger. The storm was picking up rapidly, sideways rain blasting my eyes, wind tugging at the trees by their roots. Yet somehow, stupidly, what terrified me most was the prospect that, while stumbling through those darkened woods, I might hear a little girl's voice off in the distance shouting, "Daddy!" Suddenly I froze in place. I realized I could hear the bubbling and crashing of the gutter's current, even over the storm. It must be so close. I tried to look for it, but the rain seared my eyes whenever I was not covering them with an arm. I was too terrified to take a step in any direction, but the storm took action for me by sweeping away the mud beneath my feet. Anna's fate flashed in my mind, the muddy bank giving way. My death wasn't even going to be original. I thrashed and floundered, feeling the earth seem to envelop me from below like a massive creature pulling me into its gullet. Through sheer luck, my random grabs caught purchase. A thick, sturdy tree root was all that saved me from the waters below, and I clung to it with every scrap of strength I had, even as the rain left it soaked and slippery. I managed to hold on for a while, with no way back up but unwilling to let go of my only lifeline. And then, I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle. My body tensed with such horror that I lost my grip in an instant, and those cruel waters had me. They seemed to toy with me for a while, spinning me about under the surface as I curled up into the fetal position. The shock of the frigid cold caused me to suck down a breath instinctively, filling my lungs with water. As I scratched at my chest, my eyes opened for just a split second. On either side of me were those thick, limestone walls, pockmarked with the black abysses that were caves. And that limestone led down below, far below, disappearing into that infinite, inky blackness beneath me. The experts' guesses must have been wrong. The gutter couldn't just be a few hundred feet deep. It had to be a mile, at the very least. Just looking down into that darkness, I felt the same sense of vertigo as I'd felt looking down from the roof of the Empire State Building. That, and an overwhelming sense of things looking up at me, staring back. It reminded me of joining the theater group as a kid, standing on a stage for the first time and realizing that there were over 100 pairs of eyes on me, watching me, expecting a performance. Except this time, I knew they were here to watch me die, watch me become one of them, sink down far below the surface and join them in all that darkness, never to see sunlight again, except vaguely through the surface of the water, miles above my new home. But even that didn't terrify me quite as much as the prospect of landing in one of those caves. Even as the undercurrent bashed me savagely against rocks and my lungs cried for air, my only focus was avoiding them. I swear I could see bloated arms and grasping hands reaching out from the dark of each cave, grasping for me as I passed by, as if each occupant was lonely, desperate for a companion in their eternal resting places. Suddenly, the current bashed my head against a rock, and from then everything was abstract and fuzzy. I could only muster a single coherent thought. Please, not here. It went. Don't let me die here. Somehow I knew that if I died beneath these waters, my soul would never break the surface. As if to answer my prayer, a pair of arms settled around me, Not the cold, grasping claws reaching from the caves, but something warm and comfortable, embracing me, cradling me close in a way that told me everything would be okay. Again, the next few seconds were a blur. I have no explanation for how I ended up back on the shore, shivering from the freezing waters and hacking, retching, emptying the water from my lungs upon the mud. All I know is, when I looked up, a bolt of lightning briefly illuminated the stone memorial looming above me, upon which read, "Love and Memor, Jessica Whittick." I know everything about the mythology of the Devil's Gutter because I was part of it. My family is one of the ones the school kids whisper about, the ones they make up wild stories and creepy theories about. Terminal cancer, they'd say around campfires. That was so horribly painful that not even the morphine could do anything for her. She'd been a painter, always drawing portraits of the gutter. She was the only person who thought it was beautiful, not evil. So the legend goes, she begged her husband, "Please take me to the river. Let me become part of it. I don't want to hurt anymore." They say that they did it on their anniversary, New Year's Day. I heard a long, choking rasp. For a moment, I was almost relieved. I thought it was another of my father's drunken groans. Then I realized it was coming from the river itself. I turned and beheld a dozen hands reaching out over the side of the banks, unnameable things pulling themselves up from the waters. I only caught vague glimpses of the crawling, groaning creatures, briefly illuminated by the lightning. Their skins were bleached white and transparent, looking like road maps made of veins and arteries stretched taut over gray muscles and jagged ribs and putrid organs. Many were missing legs, arms, even heads. Others were more ancient still, mummified strands of flesh seemingly loosely stitched to the crumbling remains of a skeletal structure. All seemed to be looking right at me, even though none of them had any eyes to speak of, only empty, black sockets. They were crawling forwards with horrid determination. Once the gutter had taken you into its waters, laid its claim to you, it never wanted to let you go. They were only coming to retrieve what they were owed. I tried to crawl away through the mud, but it felt like crawling in a bad dream. It felt like the very planet was turning sideways, gravity itself guiding me back towards the river. Then a figure burst through the woods, large and heavy-set. My father. He stumbled into the middle of the crowd of the dead, waving his arms, trying to seize their attention. "Take me! Take me! Not them! Take me!" He was screaming like a man possessed, but they didn't seem to even notice him. They were dead set on me, blind to the rest of the world. Then he turned to the lake, and my eyes followed his gaze to the woman from the road. Now her silhouette was standing in the middle of the river, seeming to hover a few inches above the water, her dress billowing in the wind. "Jessica! Take me! Tell them to take me!" He let out a primal, raw scream, one that must have torn his throat to shreds. "I don't want to hurt anymore." She calmly beckoned him with a finger, and in that moment, he knew what he had to do. He didn't even hesitate. He went sliding down the bank, and for a moment, he seemed to stand upon those bubbling, surging waters just like she did. His arms were stretched wide as he stumbled forward, as if ready to embrace her. And then I blinked, and they were gone. So too disappeared that legion of the dead. It seemed like they'd accepted the trade. One soul for another. The gutter always took its due. It would have been easy to tell everyone that my dad had just stumbled stupidly into the gutters during another of his drunken stupors. But I wanted people to remember his sacrifice. I weaved some tale of me falling in, and him jumping in after me and hoisting me out, even at the cost of his own life. It didn't make a lot of sense, I must admit, and some people even suspected for a while. But eventually, everybody just accepted the idea of him being a hero in his last moments, getting some redemption in the last. People like when stories get wrapped up in neat little bows. Sometimes I still dream about the two of them, floating in the center of some underwater cave chamber, yet somehow illuminated by moonlight, and by the walls of the chamber all lined with glowing, pinprick white eyes like stars in the sky. Dead but not dead, the current still flowing about them, animating them like marionettes, spinning them around each other, my mother in my father's arms like a waltz, the way they were on their wedding day. Dancing, dancing, on and on forever, before their audience of the dead.